You drop 40 grand on a wet sidewalk. You expect it to vanish. When a man in a frayed coat hands it back to a ruthless CEO and walks away without a dime, she doesn't feel gratitude. She feels suspicious. So she follows him and ruins her own reality. The wallet was midnight blue crocodile skin, custom Hermes. It cost $12,000 empty. Inside, there was exactly $10,000 in crisp, sequentially numbered hundreds. A petty cash withdrawal for a private art dealer who despised paper trails, and a vintage Patek Philippe watch with a broken clasp, worth easily 20 grand. Vivienne didn't realize it was gone until the elevator doors of her penthouse office hissed shut. She reached into the depths of her structured wool coat. Nothing. Just the slick silk lining. Her stomach didn't drop. Panic was an emotion reserved for people who couldn't afford to fix their mistakes. Vivienne could afford to fix anything. She merely clicked her tongue against her teeth, a sharp sound of irritation that made her assistant, David, stiffen instantly. "Cancel my cards," she said, stepping out onto the 72nd floor. The air up here smelled of ionized filtration and expensive cedar polish. "I dropped my wallet." "Right away, Ms. Shaw. Police report for the watch?" "Don't bother. It's gone." She walked toward her office, heels sinking into the plush carpet. She hated losing things, not for the monetary value, but for the loss of control. Someone out there in the miserable, slush-filled streets of Chicago was currently celebrating a $40,000 windfall at her expense. The thought made her jaw clench. An hour later, the internal phone on her desk buzzed. It was a harsh, jarring sound against the quiet hum of the servers down the hall. "Security, Miss Shaw. There's a man in the lobby. He says he has your wallet." Vivienne stopped typing. She stared at the flashing light on the console. "Does he want a reward?" "He hasn't asked for one. Just asked for you. We tried to take it from him, but he refused to hand it over to anyone but the ID on the driver's license." "I'll be down." She didn't take David. She took the private elevator, watching the numbers tick backward, her reflection in the mirrored doors looking pale and severe under the fluorescent lights. She expected a scam, a sob story, a shakedown. People did not return $40,000 in untraceable assets out of the goodness of their hearts. Goodness was a myth sold to children. Leverage was the currency of adults. The lobby was an expanse of white marble and sheer glass, cold and unforgiving. Standing near the security turnstiles was a man who categorically did not belong. He was tall, shoulders slightly hunched, as if accustomed to bracing against the wind. His canvas jacket was the color of old coffee, fraying at the cuffs, with a zipper that stopped halfway up. Mud crusted the soles of his work boots, leaving dry, powdery flakes on the pristine marble. Vivienne approached him. She smelled him before she spoke. Damp wool, sawdust, and the sharp, cheap scent of peppermint soap. It was an honest, tiring smell. "I'm Vivienne Shaw." She didn't extend her hand. The man looked at her. His eyes were a washed-out hazel, shadowed by deep purple bags of exhaustion. There was no awe in his expression, no intimidation, just an overwhelming sense of fatigue. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the midnight blue crocodile wallet. It looked absurdly small and expensive in his rough, calloused hand. Found it by the curb outside the French roast place on Dearborn, he said. His voice was gravelly, low. He held it out. Vivienne took it. The leather was cold from the outside air. She opened it, not breaking eye contact. The cash was there. The watch was there. The black cards were there. "Count it if you want," he said, misreading her stillness. "I don't need to." She snapped it shut. She felt entirely off balance. She reached into her coat and pulled out a silver money clip, peeling off $500 bills. "For your time." He looked at the money. He didn't blink. "No." Vivienne frowned. "Excuse me? I don't want it. It's $500. I know what it is." He shifted his weight, turning his collar up against the chill that bled through the revolving glass doors. "Have a good night, Miss Shaw." He turned and walked away. No hesitation. No lingering backward glance, hoping she'd offer more. He just pushed through the heavy doors and stepped out into the freezing November rain. Vivienne stood frozen in the lobby. The security guard watched her nervously. She looked down at the money still gripped in her hand, then at the wallet. Her chest tightened. It wasn't a warm, fuzzy feeling. It was a sharp, jagged annoyance. He had left her in a deficit, an emotional debt, a transactional imbalance. She walked quickly to the glass doors, peering out into the twilight. The man was already half a block away, head down, blending into the sea of grey coats and black umbrellas. "Hayes," she barked into her phone, dialing her driver. "Bring the car around, now. Don't go to the garage. Pick me up at the front." The Maybach idled at the curb, its massive engine emitting a barely perceptible purr. Vivienne slid into the back, the smell of premium leather and heated seats wrapping around her like a fortress. Up ahead, the man in the brown canvas jacket, she pointed a manicured finger against the tinted glass. "Follow him." Hayes looked in the rear-view mirror, his thick brows furrowing. "Follow him, ma'am?" "To where?" "Until he stops. Keep your distance." The car glided into the sluggish traffic. The wipers slapped rhythmically against the windshield, smearing the neon reflections of the city into blurry streaks of red and blue. Vivienne sat rigidly, the wallet resting on her lap. She kept dragging her thumb over the textured scales of the crocodile skin. Why was she doing this? It was absurd. She had board meetings to prepare for, a merger to finalize, 100 emails demanding her immediate, ruthless attention. But the image of the man's flat, exhausted eyes wouldn't leave her. He had walked away from $500. He had walked away from $10,000 that no one would have ever known he found. People didn't do that. Not in her world. In her world, if you left a door unlocked, someone took your house. If you showed a weakness, someone took your title. Everyone had an angle. She just had to figure out what his was. Maybe he had copied her cards. Maybe he was planning a long con. Yes, that had to be it. The man walked for 6 blocks in the driving rain. He didn't have an umbrella. The canvas jacket darkened as it soaked through. Eventually, he ducked into a bus shelter. "Pull over," Vivienne ordered. Hayes slid the heavy car into a loading zone. They waited. The interior of the car was stiflingly quiet. 10 minutes later, the 151 bus groaned to a halt. The man got on. "Follow the bus." They drove out of the loop. The towering glass monoliths of wealth gave way to the squat brick realities of the city's edges. The streetlights flickered here. The storefronts were locked behind corrugated metal grates. Pawn shops, discount liquor stores, fading laundromats. The bus stopped at a dark corner under the concrete underpass of the L train. The man stepped off. "Stop here," Vivienne said. She reached for the door handle. "Miss Shaw, you shouldn't get out here," Hayes said, his voice dropping into a warning register. "It's not safe. Lock the doors behind me. Wait right here." Before he could argue, she stepped out. The cold hit her like a physical blow. The wind whipped down the concrete tunnel, carrying the smell of wet garbage, ozone, and stale urine. She pulled her cashmere coat tight across her chest. Her $1,200 stiletto boots clicked against the cracked, uneven pavement. It was a ridiculous sound. She felt entirely exposed. She stayed half a block behind him. He didn't look back. He walked with the heavy, methodical plod of a machine winding down. He turned down a side street lined with narrow, sagging row houses and towering, windowless warehouses. The rain was turning into sleet, tiny needles of ice stinging Vivienne's cheeks. Her hair, perfectly blown out an hour ago, was plastering itself to her face in wet, heavy strands. She hated this. She hated the cold. She hated the vulnerability. But the itch in her brain pushed her forward. The man stopped in front of a 3-story brick building. The fire escape on the front was rusted, hanging by sheer stubbornness. The front door was heavy metal, covered in layers of peeling gray paint and graffiti. He pulled a ring of keys from his pocket, the metallic jingle cutting through the sound of the sleet, and shoved his shoulder against the door to force it open. It clicked shut behind him. Vivienne stood in the shadows of a defunct street lamp. She waited, watching the windows. A minute later, a light flicked on in a second-story window. The blinds were open. She crossed the street, stepping over a deep puddle that soaked the toe of her boot with freezing, oily water. She didn't care. She moved into the narrow alley beside the building. There was a rusted metal dumpster against the wall. She stepped onto a discarded wooden pallet to get a better angle, pressing her back against the wet brick, looking up through the side window. It was intrusive. It was borderline psychotic. She knew that. But the compulsion to dissect the anomaly of this man outweighed her sense of decorum. The window was smeared with grime, but the light inside was harsh and unforgiving, illuminating the small room like a stage play. It was a studio apartment. Barely. The walls were painted a sickly, institutional yellow. There was no sofa, just a mattress on the floor pushed into a corner, covered with a faded Spider-Man comforter. A small, battered formica table sat in the center of the room, piled high with papers. The man, Thomas, she had seen the name on a piece of mail he'd checked in the lobby earlier, was standing by a tiny kitchenette. He shrugged out of his soaking wet jacket and hung it over the back of a plastic folding chair. His flannel shirt was dark with rain at the shoulders. Then, Vivienne saw the movement on the mattress. A small boy, maybe 6 or 7 years old, sat up. He was thin. Too thin. He wore oversized sweatpants and a thick woolen sweater that looked like it had been bought at a thrift store. Vivienne held her breath, the freezing rain dripping down her neck. Ignored. Thomas walked over to the boy. He didn't look angry, or even as exhausted as he had in her lobby. His entire posture softened. He knelt by the mattress, pressing the back of his large, calloused hand against the boy's forehead. A mother's gesture, performed by a man who looked like he spent his days breaking concrete. The boy coughed. Even through the thick glass of the window, Vivienne could see the violence of the spasm. The child's small shoulders heaved, his face turning red. Thomas moved quickly. He opened a plastic pharmacy bag on the counter. He pulled out a bulky white machine, a nebulizer. He poured a small vial of liquid into the chamber, attached the mask, and brought it to the boy's face. The hum of the machine didn't reach Vivienne in the alley, but she could imagine it. The loud, rattling drone. The boy held the mask to his face, breathing in the steam, his eyes closing. Thomas sat on the floor beside the mattress, pulling his knees up, resting his head against the wall. He looked up at the ceiling. In the harsh fluorescent light, Vivienne saw the sheer, unadulterated terror in his face. It wasn't the panic of a lost wallet. It was the suffocating, grinding terror of a man who was watching his world drown, inch by inch. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a stack of envelopes, bills. They had red ink on the windows. Final notice. Shut off warning. He stared at them for a long time. Then, he looked at his son. He put the bills face down on the floor. Vivienne took a step back, her heels slipping on the wet pallet. She caught herself against the rough brick wall, scraping the skin off her knuckles. It stung sharply, but she barely registered the pain. Her chest felt incredibly tight, like she had swallowed a stone. $10,000. He had held $10,000 in cash in his hands less than 2 hours ago. It was enough to pay those bills. It was enough to buy a bed that wasn't on the floor. It was enough to buy a coat that didn't let the rain soak through to the bone. He could have taken it. He could have taken the cash and dumped the wallet. No one would have ever known. No camera caught him picking it up. He was untraceable, but he hadn't. He had spent his bus fare to come to her towering glass fortress to give it back to a woman who had offered him a measly $500 like a tip to a bellhop. Vivienne looked down at her own hands. She saw the glittering diamond on her right index finger. She saw the edge of her coat, worth more than this man's entire year of rent. She didn't feel a warm rush of philanthropy. She didn't feel the sudden cinematic urge to swoop in and be a savior. She felt sick. She felt violently, physically sick to her stomach. For 20 years, Vivienne Shaw had built an empire on the absolute certainty that everyone had a price, that human beings were fundamentally self-serving. It was how she negotiated. It was how she fired people. It was how she slept at night when she decimated competing businesses. They would do it to me, she always told herself. Everyone is out for themselves. But looking through the dirty window at the man wiping the condensation from his sick son's face, her entire philosophy fractured. He didn't have a price. His integrity wasn't for sale, not even to save himself. She backed out of the alley. The cold was fully in her bones now, shivering violently. She practically ran back to the corner, turning away from the dim glow of the apartment window. The Maybach was exactly where she had left it. Hayes jumped out to open the door, his face a mask of relief. "Miss Shaw, you're freezing. Let's get you home." Vivienne fell into the back seat. The heat washed over her, but it felt suffocating. It smelled of excess. It smelled of a life completely insulated from consequence. "No," she said, her voice shaking, though not from the cold. Hayes paused, looking back at her. "No." Vivienne pulled her phone from her pocket. She looked at the blank screen, then up at the rear-view mirror, her eyes hard, angry, and entirely awake. "Find me the landlord of that building," she said, her voice dropping an octave, returning to the ruthless CEO who annihilated problems. "And wake up David. I want a full background check on Thomas Reid by morning. Medical debt, credit history, employment." Hayes frowned. "Are you suing him, ma'am?" Vivienne stared out the window at the dark street. "No," she whispered. "I'm going to ruin his life." She didn't mean it maliciously, but when Vivienne Shaw dismantled a structure, she didn't leave a single brick standing. And she was about to tear Thomas Reid's entire miserable world down to the studs, just so she could rebuild it. The dossier was bound in a standard manila folder, resting precisely in the center of Vivienne's glass desk. It smelled of fresh toner and David's nervous sweat. It was 7:15 a.m. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago was a gray, frozen grid. Inside, the climate control hummed a sterile, perfect 70 degrees. Vivienne didn't touch her espresso. She opened the folder. Thomas Reid, 34 years old, independent contractor, union carpenter, widowed 2 years ago, ovarian cancer, late-stage detection. Vivienne's eyes flicked over the medical bills. They were staggered like a staircase leading into a black hole. $84,000 to a private oncology group, $12,000 to an anesthesiologist, another $40,000 spread across 4 different high-interest credit cards, likely used to keep the lights on and buy groceries while he sat by a hospital bed. Then came the son, Leo Reid, 7 years old, chronic severe asthma, exacerbated by environmental factors. Vivienne knew what that meant. It meant the damp, rotting walls of the slum she had stood outside last night. It meant black mold hiding behind peeling baseboards. She turned the page. The landlord of the building was a man named Arthur Fogel. He owned 12 properties in the greater metropolitan area, all in historically redlined districts, all racking up code violations faster than the city could process the paperwork. Fogel's business model was simple: rent to the desperate, ignore the maintenance, and evict when the money dried up. Thomas was currently 3 months behind on rent. An eviction notice had been filed on Tuesday. Vivienne closed the folder. The sharp smack of the cardboard echoed in the vast, quiet office. She stared at the midnight blue crocodile wallet, which now sat on the corner of her desk like an unexploded bomb. He had walked away from $10,000 while an eviction notice sat on his kitchen counter. It defied logic. It defied the fundamental laws of survival that Vivienne had built her entire worldview upon. It was an error in the code, and Vivienne Shaw did not tolerate errors. She fixed them, brutally, if necessary. "David," she said. Her assistant appeared in the doorway instantly, a tablet clutched to his chest. "Yes, Mrs. Shaw." "Get Arthur Fogel on the phone. Do not ask for an appointment. Tell his secretary that Vivienne Shaw of Shaw Holdings is calling regarding an immediate, all-cash acquisition of his property on 43rd Street. and if he doesn't pick up within 30 seconds, I will buy his primary lender and call in his commercial mortgages. David swallowed hard. Right away. 10 minutes later, the line blinked. Vivienne picked it up, skipping the pleasantries. Mr. Fogel, you own a 3-story brick walk-up on 43rd. It has 14 active code violations, including structural water damage and faulty wiring. I want it. There was a heavy, wet breathing on the other end of the line. Mrs. Shaw, I wasn't aware Shaw Holdings was interested in residential developments in that sector. I'm not. I'm interested in that specific plot. I will wire you $1.2 million by noon. That is 20% above market value for a condemned teardown, which is what your building is. Well now, wait just a minute. Fogel's voice took on the slick, greasy cadence of a negotiator. That building generates reliable passive income. I'd need at least 1.5 to even consider. Arthur, Vivienne interrupted, her voice dropping to a register that routinely made grown men sweat. I am not negotiating with you. I have already dispatched my legal team to the Department of Buildings. If you do not accept the wire transfer by noon, I will personally fund a class action lawsuit on behalf of your tenants across all 12 of your properties. I will tie you up in discovery for the next half-decade. I will bleed you dry in legal fees until you are forced to liquidate your assets at pennies on the dollar. You will not see a courtroom. You will see bankruptcy. Silence. Just the faint, staticky sound of Fogel recalculating his existence. I'll have my attorney send the transfer details, he muttered. Good. One more thing. As the new owner, I am executing an immediate termination of all month-to-month leases on that property. I want the eviction notices drafted and delivered by 6 o'clock tonight. Vivienne hung up. She didn't feel a rush of victory. She felt a cold, mechanical satisfaction. The pieces were moving. Next, she bought the debt. This took longer. She had her acquisitions team trace the medical debts sold to third-party collection agencies. They were scavengers, buying human misery for pennies on the dollar and harassing the survivors. Vivienne authorized her team to purchase Thomas Reid's entire debt portfolio. It cost her a fraction of the actual total, about $22,000. By 4 p.m., she owned the paper on Thomas's life. She owned the roof over his head, and she owned the financial chains around his ankles. She stood up, smoothing the front of her tailored slacks. Cancel my evening appointments, she told David as she walked past his desk. Tell Hayes to bring the car around. We're going back to 43rd Street. The rain from the night before had turned into a hard, biting frost. The streets were slick with black ice. When the Maybach pulled up to the curb outside the rotting brick building, the sky was the color of a bruised plum. Vivienne stepped out. She didn't hide in the alley this time. She walked straight up the cracked concrete steps and pushed open the heavy front door. The hallway smelled aggressively of bleach, trying to mask the scent of stale cooking oil and mildew. The linoleum peeled at the corners, curling up like dead leaves. She walked up to the second floor. Her heels clicked loudly against the exposed wood of the stairs. She stopped in front of apartment 2B. She knocked. 3 sharp, authoritative raps. A moment later, the deadbolt slid back with a heavy, metallic clack. The door opened halfway. Thomas stood there. He was wearing the same faded flannel shirt, though it was dry now. His hands were covered in a fine layer of chalky white drywall dust. When he saw her, the exhaustion in his face instantly hardened into a mask of pure, guarded confusion. "Miss Shaw," his voice was low, wary. "What are you doing here?" Vivienne looked past his shoulder. The apartment was exactly as she had seen it through the window. The mattress on the floor, the piles of paperwork. The little boy, Leo, was sitting at the formica table, coloring with a broken blue crayon. He looked up, his breathing shallow and slightly raspy. "I came to deliver this," Vivienne said. She reached into her coat and pulled out a thick, legal envelope, holding it out to him. Thomas wiped his dusty hands on his jeans and took it. He didn't open it immediately. He looked at the heavy cream paper, then up at her immaculate, unreadable face. "What is it?" "It's a notice to vacate. I purchased this building at noon today. The property is being redeveloped. You have 24 hours to remove your belongings." The air in the hallway seemed to freeze. All the oxygen sucked out of the space between them. Thomas stared at her. He looked down at the envelope, then back up. The muscle in his jaw feathered. A slow, dark flush crept up his neck, settling into the heavy bags under his eyes. He didn't yell. He didn't crumble. Instead, he stepped out into the hallway, pulling the door mostly shut behind him so the boy couldn't hear. When he looked back at her, his hazel eyes were practically burning. The sheer force of his anger was a physical weight pressing against her chest. "You followed me," he whispered, his voice shaking with a rage so profound it rattled the dust on his collar. "You followed me home, you looked at my life, and you bought my building just to throw me out on the street." "It's a business decision," Vivienne said smoothly, though her heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Business?" He took a step toward her. He was 6 inches taller, broad-shouldered, hands calloused from years of tearing things down and building them up. He could have snapped her in half, but he kept his hands rigidly at his sides. "I gave you your money back. I gave it back when I needed it more than you have ever needed anything in your miserable, padded life. And this is what you do?" "No good deed," Vivienne said, her voice ice-cold, "goes unpunished, Mr. Reid." Thomas laughed. It was a broken, jagged sound. "You're sick. You're actually sick in the head. You couldn't handle that someone didn't want your scraps, so you decided to take the only thing I had left." He shoved the envelope back against her chest. She stumbled back half a step, her hand instinctively coming up to catch it. "I'm not leaving," he said, his voice dropping to a lethal calm. "I have nowhere to go. My son is sick. You want me out? You're gonna have to send the sheriffs to drag me out by my teeth." He turned and slammed the door in her face. The wood rattled in its frame. Vivienne stood in the dim, foul-smelling hallway, the eviction notice clutched in her manicured hand. Her knuckles were white. Her breath came slightly faster than normal. She had just done the most monstrous thing she had ever done in her life. She had looked a drowning man in the eyes and poured water down his throat. And yet, as she turned and walked down the stairs, listening to the sharp click of her heels, the tight, suffocating knot in her chest began to loosen. She wasn't destroying him. She was resetting the board. And tomorrow, she was going to force him to play a different game. The next morning, at precisely 9 a.m., a heavy, insistent knock rattled the door of apartment 2B. Thomas was already awake. He hadn't slept. He was sitting on the floor, surrounded by 3 black trash bags filled with clothes, staring at the wall. Beside him, Leo was asleep on the mattress, his small chest rising and falling with a faint, wheezing whistle. Thomas stood up, his joints aching. He picked up a heavy metal wrench from his toolbox. If she had sent private security to drag them out, he was going to make them bleed for it. He unlatched the deadbolt and yanked the door open. It wasn't the police. It wasn't armed security. It was Hayes, the driver. He was wearing a dark, tailored suit, standing with his hands clasped respectfully in front of him. Behind him stood 4 men in matching grey uniforms with a moving company logo stitched on the breast. "Good morning, Mr. Reid," Hayes said, his voice deep and entirely devoid of malice. "Ms. Shaw sent us." Thomas gripped the wrench, his knuckles white. "Tell Ms. Shaw she can go to hell. I told her last night I'm not leaving until a judge forces me." "Mr. Reid," Hayes said gently, stepping just slightly into the doorway, "please, put the wrench down. I'm not here to throw you on the street." Hayes reached into his inner suit pocket and withdrew a thick manila folder, the same one Vivienne had read yesterday, and a set of silver keys on a leather ring. He held them out. Thomas didn't move. "What is that?" "It's a reallocation of assets, sir. That's what she called it." Hayes offered a small, apologetic smile. "Ms. Shaw doesn't know how to do things normally. She only knows how to execute takeovers." Thomas frowned, his grip on the wrench loosening slightly. He took the folder. It was heavy. He opened it. The first page was a deed, a condominium in Lincoln Park, 3 miles away, a neighborhood with tree-lined streets, excellent public schools, and less than 10 minutes from the pediatric pulmonology wing at Memorial Hospital. The deed was listed under a trust, the Leo Reid Irrevocable Trust. Thomas flipped the page. His breath caught in his throat. It was a letter from a collection agency. Across the front, stamped in heavy red ink, was a single word: satisfied. The balance was 0. He flipped to the next page. Another agency. Satisfied. The credit cards. Satisfied. Over $140,000 of crushing, suffocating weight. Wiped out. Erased like it had never existed. "The men behind me are bonded movers," Hayes said quietly. "They will pack whatever you wish to keep. There is a car downstairs waiting to take you and your son to the new property. It's fully furnished, though Ms. Shaw insists you can throw out whatever you don't like. The air filtration system was installed overnight." Thomas stared at the paper. The words began to blur. A strange, high-pitched ringing filled his ears. His legs felt suddenly weak, the adrenaline of the past 12 hours evaporating, leaving nothing but a hollow, shaking exhaustion. "Why?" Thomas whispered, his voice cracking. He looked up at Hayes, his eyes wide and panicked. "Why is she doing this?" "I couldn't tell you, sir," Hayes replied honestly. "I've driven that woman for 8 years. I've watched her gut corporations and fire hundreds of people without blinking. But when you walked out of that lobby 2 days ago, Hayes shook his head. You broke something in her. I think this is her way of fixing it. Thomas looked back into the apartment. Leo was stirring, rubbing his eyes, the morning light catching the dust motes dancing in the cold air. He looked down at the keys in his hand. The metal was cold, solid, and impossibly heavy. 3 hours later, Vivienne sat at her desk. She was reviewing a quarterly earnings report, but she hadn't processed a single number in 45 minutes. The internal phone buzzed. Ms. Shaw, David said, his voice strained. Mr. Reid is here. Again. Security tried to stop him, but... Send him in, Vivienne interrupted. The heavy glass doors of her office swung open. Thomas walked in. He looked entirely out of place in the vast, hyper-modern room. But he didn't look defeated anymore. He had showered. He wore a clean denim jacket over a white t-shirt. The haunted, hunted look in his eyes had been replaced by a chaotic storm of emotions, anger, disbelief, and a profound, terrifying vulnerability. He walked straight up to her desk. He didn't sit. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the manila folder, dropping it on the glass. It landed with a heavy, final thud right next to the midnight blue crocodile wallet. Vivienne leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs. She kept her face perfectly smooth, a mask of polished stone. Is there a problem with the title? She asked clinically. My lawyers assured me the trust structure was ironclad. Thomas put his hands on the edge of her desk, leaning in. He smelled faintly of clean soap and the sharp tang of adrenaline. You think you can just do this? He demanded, his voice thick with emotion. You think you can just rip someone's life apart and put it back together however you want, just because you have the money? Yes, Vivienne said simply. I do. You don't get to play God with my son. I'm not playing God, Mr. Reid. I'm playing real estate and debt consolidation. The environment your son was living in was functionally a death sentence. Now, it isn't. You can be angry at my methods, but you cannot argue with the results. I don't even know you, Thomas exploded, his voice echoing off the glass walls. I don't know you, and you don't know me. You gave me a house. You wiped out my debt. People don't do this. What is the catch? What do you want from me? Vivienne stared at him. She looked at the pulse beating frantically in his neck. She looked at the calluses on his knuckles pressing against her pristine desk. She felt that sickening, uncomfortable tightness in her chest again. The raw, jagged edge of human empathy. An emotion she had starved for decades. I don't want anything from you, she said, her voice dropping, losing some of its icy armor. 2 nights ago, you stood in my lobby. You were exhausted. You were broke. And you were holding $10,000 of my money. You could have taken it. It would have saved you. But you didn't. She uncrossed her legs, leaning forward slightly. You made me feel something, Thomas. You made me realize that my entire philosophy on human nature was flawed. That irritated me. It irritated me immensely. Thomas stared at her, his brow furrowed, trying to decipher the absolute madness of her logic. So you bought me a house because I annoyed you? I fixed a deficit, Vivienne corrected. You returned something of value to me. It required an equal transfer of value in return. The cash in the wallet was insufficient. The housing and the debt clearance balance the ledger. We are now even. Thomas let out a breath that sounded half like a laugh and half like a sob. He ran a hand through his hair, looking around the massive, sterile office, then back down to the woman sitting across from him. She was terrifying. She was completely unhinged, and she had just saved his son's life. He didn't say thank you. He sensed instinctively that if he showed gratitude, she would shut down entirely. She needed this to be a transaction to survive it. The HVAC in that condo, Thomas said slowly, his voice rough. It's top of the line, but the intake vents in the second bedroom are rattling. The ductwork wasn't secured properly. Vivienne blinked, caught off guard. I will have the contractor reprimanded. Don't, Thomas said. He stood up straight. I'm a carpenter. I can fix it. I'll run down to the hardware store, get some self-tapping screws and foiled tape. I'll fix it myself. He wasn't just talking about the vents. He was talking about his life. She had given him the structure, but he was going to be the one to maintain it. He wasn't a charity case. He was a man going back to work. Vivienne looked at him, and for the first time in perhaps 20 years, a genuine, unguarded smile touched the corners of her mouth. It was a small, fragile thing, but it changed her entire face. Good, she said softly. See that you do. Thomas held her gaze for a long moment. There were 1,000 things unsaid between them, a violent collision of two entirely different worlds that had somehow left both of them intact. He nodded once, a slow, deliberate tilt of his head. Then he turned and walked out of the office, his footsteps heavy and grounded on the plush carpet. Vivienne sat alone in the silence. The climate control hummed. Outside, the grey clouds were finally beginning to break, letting a harsh, brilliant shaft of winter sunlight pierce through the glass, illuminating the dust motes in the air. She looked down at the midnight blue crocodile wallet. She reached out and touched the textured leather. She didn't feel suspicious anymore. She didn't feel the need to control every variable in the room. For the first time, Vivienne Shaw felt the strange, terrifying warmth of simply being human, and she found that she didn't hate it at all. If this raw look at wealth, desperation, and unexpected human dignity moved you, hit the like button. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that integrity isn't dead. And subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable, pulse-pounding stories about the hidden depths of human nature.